My name is Shmuel Lamm, and welcome aboard. Good evening. As you can probably tell, it is evening outside. And tonight, we'll be learning chapter 116, Perek Kuf Tet Zayin of Tehillim, Le'iloi Nishma Mayat Sarah, Sarah Rivka Bat Harav Nachum Umindel. To start things off, let's overview the Perek a bit, after which we'll zero in on a particularly perplexing line. Perek Kuf Tet Zayin should seem familiar, as we recite it during Hallel, and it deals with familiar themes, such as tragedy and deliverance, really themes that span throughout Tehillim. The Perek climaxes, though, in a deluge of praise and appreciation for God's salvation, and so, ultimately, we can characterize it as a psalm of thanksgiving. Thanksgiving to God for guiding us when all else fails. So, at its core, thanksgiving. Now, rather than gobble down the Perek whole, let's look at a particular somewhat haunting line. Pasuk Tet Vav, verse 15, begins the climax, where the psalmist culminates in his outburst of thanksgiving to God, and it reads, Yakar be'inei Hashem amaftala chasidav. The deaths of God's saints is yakar in his eyes, is yakar in God's eyes. And as you can probably guess from the fact that I didn't translate it, it's the word yakar where we run into trouble. In fact, it can be somewhat disturbing. Dr. J. Emerton points out that many would translate yakar, the word yakar, as precious or dear. So the pasuk reads, precious in the eyes of God is the death of his saints. The death of his saints is precious in God's eyes. Now, this translation might seem reasonable at first glance, as the saints who die, especially al Kiddush Hashem, or for the sake of heaven, are certainly precious and meaningful. But if we scrutinize more closely, however, this translation does cast a disturbing shadow. Rather than refer to the saints themselves, grammatically, yakar here applies to the word death, meaning it would be the deaths themselves that we're saying are precious. And the problem with saying this is that while a death can be valorous in certain situations, such as, again, a situation in which we're forced to sacrifice ourselves, al Kiddush Hashem, it's not an ideal towards which we as Jews aspire. We don't grow up saying, I hope one day to give my life. Indeed, we identify with the story of Yitzchak, where God Himself stops the Akedah, the death of Yitzchak al Kiddush Hashem. So, how can we reconcile our beliefs with a pasuk that seems to glorify in death itself? It seems like we're forced back to our original question: how do we translate Yakar be'inei Hashem, amaftala chasidav? And in order to solve this pasuk, we can try using a different possible translation of yakar. In fact, another one suggested by Emerton. Let's translate yakar not as precious, but rather as costly or grievous. Indeed, Emerton finds support for this translation in yakar's Aramaic parallels, so this translation does have linguistic backing. And according to this translation then, rather than the deaths of the saints being precious, or something to want more of, we can say that it's the exact opposite. That in the eyes of God, the deaths of saints are grievous, or tragic, or costly. And this new translation really could solve our previous confusion over the pasuk. The word grievous aligns not only with the plain meaning of the text, but also our philosophic underpinnings. If we can't identify with deaths of saintly people being precious, we could still certainly identify with the deaths of saintly people being tragic. And so it seems that we've arrived at our ideal translation. In the eyes of God, the deaths of His saints are grievous. Now, even though it does seem that we've arrived at that ideal translation, we still do have one more question to ask. What is this pasuk doing in our Psalm of Thanksgiving? I mean, why include it? If the reason is simply in order to acknowledge and be thankful that God doesn't want His people to die, then why are we singling out His Hasidim, His saints? Shouldn't it read instead, it's tragic in God's eyes when His people die or His loved ones die? Why don't we say it's grievous in God's eyes for all of those people? Why single out saints? Now, of course, one might say it's simply because the psalmist wants to punctuate the verse in order to dramatize or emphasize the message. So he uses saints for dramatic effect. And he wants to show that God rather people live than die. And that would work fine, and we could accept that answer. But perhaps there's something deeper that we can derive from this anomaly, the fact that we only use saints as opposed to something else. And in order to get to this meaning, we should ask ourselves, what is significant about the usage of saints to illustrate this pasuk? Well, on a non-technical level, saints are spiritually elevated in the eyes of God. They've reached a higher plane of service to Him, and as such, are worthy of our praise and commendation. Now, if this is so, that Hasidim serve God on such a high level, then perhaps God's attitude towards these saints can indicate, for us, the ideals around which we as Jews should revolve. So, what does God want from the saints, from His ideal servants? According to our first interpretation of Yakar as precious, it would be the deaths. God glorifies in the deaths of His saints. But instead, if we translate the word as grievous, that the deaths of saints is tragic in the eyes of God, then it means the exact opposite. That the ideal relationship between man and God de-emphasizes death. That death is not ideal. That rather than death, Judaism orbits life and living in God's world as opposed to in God's world as a servant of God. Now, in the face of tragedy or despair or strife, this really is something to be deeply thankful about. That however bad it gets, we can seek solace in the knowledge that God cherishes life over death. That for His most zealous servants to die is a higher tragedy rather than an ideal. And that for us to grow and succeed in the world is what God does, in fact, desire. Now, as mentioned earlier, we recite Psalm Kuftet Zion as part of Hallel, where we give praise and thanks to God at the very least on a monthly basis, and sometimes more often than that. And very often we sing Kuftet Zion, Ahavti Ki Ishma, starting from the words Ma'ashiv LaHashem. And it's during that song where verse 15, about God and death and Yakar, are often part of a dramatic climax. And very often at that point there's a sudden upsurge in the singing and people become so deeply involved in it, and it's a beautiful thing. And perhaps with this deeper understanding of Pasuk Tetvav, that it gives thanksgiving for the fact that despite the tragedy we face, God still places more value on life than death. Perhaps with this deeper understanding of Pasuk Tetvav, we can enhance the song and make it even more meaningful than it was to us before. Thank you very much.